The knocking didn't come from the door, it came from the window, sharp, frantic. And when Martha spun around, heart pounding from the fire she'd just barely rekindled with a scrap of pine bark, she saw her boy's face framed in the frostbit glass. He was mouthing something. No sound came through. His mittened hands pounded again. Then the voice hit like a slap. "Mama! They're coming!" She threw the door open without her boots and charged into the snow, her skirts already stiff from the freeze that hadn't lifted in days. Roy's legs were red down to the knee where the wool had soaked through. Behind him, 3 other figures came stumbling across the field. One of them fell, just collapsed, and the others didn't stop, just dragged him like he was a sack of kindling. No horses, no wagon, nothing but frost on their brows and that desperate, wild look of people who had run out of places to run. She didn't ask. She turned back toward the strange, lumpy mound behind her cabin, the one everyone in town had mocked. She had been mocked too, especially by men with loud opinions and thin jackets who hadn't lasted long once the weather turned for real. But they weren't here now, were they? She ripped aside the flap of stitched oilcloth, the one she'd weighted with riverstones to keep it pressed against the snowdrift. Warmth blasted out, not from a fire, but from inside the hay itself, where months of dry-stored bales lined every wall and hollowed chamber of the dugout she'd built like some stubborn, half-mad badger. Steam curled up from the children's breath as they crawled in ahead of her, and the second she pulled the flap down behind them, the wind howled across the empty plains like it had lost its prey. The truth was, no one had cared much for what Martha Dillon did with her time, ever since her husband was buried in the thaw of 78. Men said it was a shame she didn't remarry, though no one offered, not seriously anyhow, and she'd stopped asking for help after the second time one of them cut corners on the job and left her cellar half-roofed and leaking. So she started doing things her own way. She knew about hay from her father's side, growing up in a sod hut that reeked of animals and survival, knew it didn't burn easy if it was packed tight, knew it held heat and blocked wind better than log walls if you laid it thick and dry and high. What she didn't know was that it would become the very thing that saved more than just her children. It started late that October, when the weather broke early and the church bells stopped after a single Sunday frost. Snow came before the ground was ready, piles of it, like the Lord flipped a quilt over the land and forgot to leave a chimney hole. By mid-November, the river was crusted solid, and the dirt roads were just white scars in the hills. That's when the laughing began. She could hear them from town. "Dillon's packing straw like she's burying a cow. Hope she ain't planning on sleeping in that haystack. She's one lantern tip from roasting her whole farm." It might have bothered her once, but with her boys coughing at night and the firewood soaked from early storms, she didn't have time for pride. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to keep her children from freezing solid, like the Mackie girl they found curled against a fence post. So she stacked, she packed, she hollowed, she sealed the floor with dried mud, and pounded out walls tight as a barrel. Every crevice she stuffed with old potato sacks and muslin, and above it all, she bent saplings into an arch and laid the hay thick like bricks of gold no one wanted. When they laughed, she worked harder, and when she ran out of twine, she braided her own from horsehair and willow cord. By the time the real blizzard came down, the Hay-Bale hut was half submerged, squat and ugly, warm as a cellar oven inside. That morning, the morning the knocking came, she'd thought she'd made it through the worst. But survival doesn't just come once. It's a long crawl over cold days and colder doubts. Roy had gone out to fetch water, or what passed for it, chipping chunks from the edge of the stream with the little hatchet. He was 11, and she'd nearly bitten through her tongue trying not to say what she'd really meant. "Don't go too far, don't disappear." He came back shaking. "They're out there." That was all he said. Now the newcomers were huddled inside the hay walls, still not speaking. Martha handed them cups of boiled roots and dried turnip broth. Not much, but it thawed their tongues. The first to talk was the older boy, maybe 17, maybe 20. Winter took age from faces. "Our cabin collapsed. Pa went back for Ma. They never," he choked. "We ran." "How long?" she asked. 3 days. The other boy, barely taller than Roy, rocked back and forth by the fireless pit in the center. The shelter was built to trap body heat, not feed flame. Fire took too much, risked too much. She'd tried to explain that to the men who sneered at her hay coffin, but they didn't want to hear. She leaned toward him now. "What's your name?" He wouldn't answer. His lips were cracked and purple. But the smallest girl finally said, "Isaac. He's my brother. My name's Ruth." Martha nodded once, like it had been settled. The wind didn't stop that night. It beat the earth flat for miles around and peeled roofs like a claw. Somewhere near dawn, a tree cracked in the hills, and Roy whispered in the dark, "That sounded like the parson's pine." Martha's breath clouded, but it didn't sting her nose. That meant the hay was holding. The warmth came slow, like a sleeping dog curling closer to your legs. By morning, The walls sweated, not enough to drip, just enough to prove the inside was living while the world outside went grey and still. They took turns keeping watch, not for bandits. No one raided in this cold, but for signs of other strays. 2 days later they found a man crawling on his elbows, fingers black, eyes rolling like a spooked horse. They dragged him in, wrapped him in cloth, wept when he died 2 hours later. She buried him in hay and let the ground take him later. The second to arrive was a woman with a baby. The baby wasn't crying. That scared her more than anything. By the end of the second week, there were 10 people in that Hay-Bale shelter, 2 of them children not her own, 3 with frostbitten feet, 1 with half a face burned from a chimney fire, blinking from the warmth like he'd stumbled into heaven by accident. And then came the hard part. The laughing hadn't just stopped, it had turned. It began with Deputy Knox, who showed up, red-eyed and limping with one boot frozen around his ankle like a cast. "You got room for one more?" She looked at the others. They didn't speak, but none of them said no. He sat down in silence. "I told the sheriff that chimney was cracked," he muttered. She didn't reply. The sheriff was dead. So was half of Main Street. Most had tried to flee or fight the cold with old tricks that didn't hold up once the wind started eating the nails from your rafters. Word spread. Even without horses, people followed the tracks in the snow. A ridge here, a line of prints there. Men stumbled in, gaunt and hollow-eyed, the same ones who'd pointed and called it a straw hut. She let them in anyway. What else could she do? By mid-December, her Hay-Bale shelter was full, and people were still coming. It was never supposed to hold 15 people. The Hay-Bale shelter had been built for 3, Martha, Roy, and little Henry. She hadn't accounted for the weight of other bodies pressing into the walls at night, for the warmth of so many breathers saturating the packed air, for the way the ceiling began to sweat so heavily it had to be scraped down every morning before droplets soaked the thatch and ruined it. The floor was a mess of straw and blankets and cracked boots by the 3rd week, and the smell, human, sour, a little like a cowshed in spring, never fully left. But it was better than the smell of death, better than the stench of frozen blood in the church crypt, where they said the Turner family had holed up and lit every candle they owned and still froze together in one long breath. Here, inside this hay-brick womb Martha had packed with her own hands, people lived. They coughed and sweated and fidgeted, but they lived. Sometimes that was enough, but sometimes it wasn't. The turning point came the morning they found the fox. Roy had gone out before dawn, wrapped in every wool scrap they had, even old dresses torn into strips and looped around his calves. He only meant to check the snare line she'd laid 2 weeks earlier. More hope than strategy. When he came back, his face was covered in blood. Martha stood up so fast she nearly struck her head on the bent rafters. "It ain't mine," he breathed. "It's the fox's." It was a tiny thing, thin as ribs, but it was food. She had seen men kill for less. And in this shelter, that was the moment she realized. Not everyone who stayed here was going to behave like family just because they were sleeping shoulder to shoulder. She cleaned it alone, boiling the meat with turnip rinds and a dusting of cornmeal she'd hidden behind the mud wall crevice. She didn't offer it to the loudest man or the oldest. She gave the first bowl to Ruth, who hadn't spoken in 4 days, and had started coughing through the night, then to Roy, then to the mother with the baby, then to the rest, one by one, based not on age or strength, but on who needed it most. The quietest man got the last ladle. The loudest grumbled, but no one backed him. Martha didn't make speeches. She just worked. That was when the rules began to form, not by words, but by the shape of things. People waited. People watched. No one dared step out of line, because the truth had settled in like the frost itself. This was Martha Dillon's shelter, and if it weren't for her, they'd all be bones beneath snow. Later that night, after the fireless heat had climbed back up and the children slept draped over one another like pups in a den, she sat alone near the flap. Knox was across from her, still nursing the limp in his leg. "You ever think," he said slowly, "this thing saved the whole town?" She didn't answer. She didn't like talking when it felt like praise. He went on anyway. "I remember you dragging those bales by yourself. Folks laughing. Said you'd lost your mind after losing your man. Said you were desperate," she said flatly. He nodded. "That was one word." They sat in silence. Then she said something that surprised even herself. "I was." Another pause. "Well, desperate worked." "Not yet," she murmured. He didn't understand, but she wasn't speaking to him. She was thinking of the fields still buried, the stores still empty, the storm still out there like a great beast sleeping just past the door. It was on the 23rd night that the shelter nearly gave out. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't hunger, it was breath. With so many inside, the air grew thick. The walls, though packed, couldn't keep up with the exhale of 15 living bodies. Condensation turned to damp, damp to mold. The air grew wet. Ruth woke in a sweat with a rattling in her chest. The baby coughed. One of the older men started shivering despite being layered under 3 blankets. They weren't cold, they were suffocating. Martha made her choice fast. She clawed out a vent. It took hours. She chose the far corner, away from the bedding and the children, and peeled back the outer bales one at a time, careful not to collapse the support. She cut through the inner hay like a surgeon, using her sewing knife, carving a slow tunnel upward and outward until she reached the frost pack. Then she hacked it with the back of her boot, over and over until light spilled in like water and cold air poured down like judgment. Steam rose. The room sighed. She patched the sides with stiffened cloth, lined the edge with clay paste, a chimney of air, nothing more, nothing less. But when she returned to the main space, she saw the eyes on her. Saved us again, Knox muttered. Martha said nothing. It wasn't heroism, it was survival. But not everyone saw it that way. There were whispers now, murmurs at night, quiet voices from the far wall. She couldn't make out the words, but she felt them, smelled them, like rot in the hay. Knox wasn't the only man who'd come in humbled. One of the others, Jeffers, a blacksmith before the frost, had started questioning her every move, asking if she was hiding more food, if she was picking favorites. "I just think," he said one night, too loud for it to be an accident, "that maybe we ought to vote on how the rations get handed out." Martha didn't raise her voice. She stood, slow and even, hands still stained from stripping bark to make tea. "You want to vote?" she said. "You go outside and find yourself a ballot." He stared at her. So did the rest. No one moved. "You want heat? You want walls? You want that baby not to die tonight?" Her voice never cracked. "Then you sit your tail down and drink the broth I made." And for a moment the Hay-Bale shelter was dead quiet. Jeffers sat down. Knox said later, "You scare grown men without lifting a hand." She shook her head. "No, the cold scares them. I just remind them it's still out there. They lost one, not to cold, not to hunger, but to memory. A woman named Clara, maybe 35, wandered out just after dawn, while Martha was scraping ice from the cloth flap, said she needed air, said she would be back. She wasn't. They searched. Roy and Knox walked a half-mile in each direction. No tracks. The wind had swallowed her. She could have stepped 10 feet from the shelter and been buried under a drift, or walked till her feet went black and her mind gave up. Martha sat up all night that night, didn't speak, didn't blink much, just sat, sewing another seam in a blanket that didn't need it. Someone asked, "You think she did it on purpose?" She didn't answer. She already knew. Then came the second wave. January hit like a war drum, hard, sudden. The town's few survivors, maybe 2 dozen, stumbled toward her shelter with wild eyes and empty hands. And for the first time, Martha said no. "I can't fit more," they begged. One man offered a silver pocket watch. A woman offered a ring. Another said they'd trade food, but none of them had any. Knox stood behind Martha as she told them. He hated it. She saw it on his face, but he didn't argue. That night, 2 of the men from the crowd tried to break in. They came after dark, pulled back the flap, tried to crawl through the vent. One of them got a foot inside before Martha jabbed him with a fire-hardened pole she kept near the corner. She didn't say a word, just jabbed hard enough to make him yelp and fall backward into the snow. She sat by the vent the rest of the night. Knox joined her before dawn. "You gonna sleep?" She didn't look at him. "No. You always this stubborn?" She finally turned. "You always ask questions you already know the answers to?" He chuckled. "Fair." By late January, the shelter was down to the dregs. No meat, no cornmeal, no beans, just bark and snow melt, and what little heat they could trap from each other. Roy started coughing blood. The baby had stopped crying again. Then came the sound, distant, sharp, hooves. A horse. No, 2. She grabbed Roy, shook him awake, ran outside without boots. They came from the east, ranchers, still alive. They'd built pits under their floorboards, packed with animal fat and peat. They had food, not much, but they had it, and they brought news. "The roads are clearing," one of them said. "We're forming a ride to the railroad town, 4 days south. Wagons can't go, but people can." Knox turned to Martha. "What do we do?" She looked at the shelter. The baby, Roy, Ruth, the wounded man with the half-burned face, Jeffers, now too thin to lift his own arm. "We don't move," she said. "Not yet. You sure? I didn't build this place to get people halfway alive." She stared into the sun that had just crested the hills, melting nothing. She rationed bark water for 5 more days, slept in snatches, watched the vent, prayed the wind wouldn't shift. Then one morning the air didn't bite. She walked outside and didn't feel the frost carve into her cheeks. Birdsong, real birdsong. Spring had come, not warm, Not yet, but enough. It wasn't Thor. Not yet, but it was something. The first signs came small, tiny things, barely worth noticing unless you'd lived under earth and straw for 49 days. The snow no longer howled against the hay walls. The sun didn't feel like a knife. And when Martha touched the air outside with her bare hand, it no longer stung so sharp it felt like punishment. That morning, a bird landed on the edge of the shelter's vent. It was skinny, missing half its tail feathers, but it sat, looked around, pecked at the crusted ice, and flew away. And in the silence that followed, Ruth whispered, barely audible, "Spring." Martha didn't reply. She didn't trust that word yet. Spring had broken hearts before. Spring had tricked people out of shelters too soon. Spring was a liar until it wasn't. But the truth was this: the shelter had done its work, not just sheltering bodies, but shaping people into something else. 15 still lived. 15 who had come from barns, broken wagons, collapsed cabins, burned hearths. 15 souls packed into a box of straw and sweat and silence, who had seen things they wouldn't name and sat shoulder to shoulder through the long dark without killing each other. That wasn't luck, that was law, Martha's law, unspoken, unbent, and now, for the first time, the law might be able to loosen, but not too fast. That day, Martha allowed them out in pairs. She'd built crude foot wraps from the remains of their clothes, and old quilt batting stitched with horsehair, wrapped tight with wire and string. Knox and Jeffers went first. They were the largest, and Knox still had one good foot. They carried poles to test the snow and mark paths. When they returned, they had news. "The creek's melted through at the bend," Knox said, wiping his face. "You can see it, plain as day. There's a flow. Weak, but real." Jeffers added, "Saw a raccoon print too? Fresh?" Martha nodded. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Any bodies?" Knox paused. "None." That night, for the first time in weeks, no one coughed through the dark. No one moaned in sleep, and Martha allowed herself to lay down on her side, face turned toward the earthen wall, and rest more than her bones. 2 days later, the first real crack appeared. Not in the hay, not in the shelter, but among the people. It began with Isaac. The boy had hardly spoken since he'd arrived, just grunted, sometimes nodded. He did what was asked and little more. But that morning, Martha caught him digging through her storage crevice while everyone else slept. She said his name, low and even. He froze. "You think I don't notice?" she asked. He turned, cheeks flushed red, mouth opening to explain. But she didn't let him. "Didn't say you were wrong," she said. "Just saying it's not time." He stared at her, anger bleeding into shame. He held out the lump of dried flour in his hand. She could see it crumbling. "I'm hungry," he said. It was the first time he'd looked her in the eye. "We all are," she answered. He didn't put it back, but he didn't eat it either. She took it gently, wrapped it in an old cloth, and said, "Next week." Isaac nodded once. That night he was the last to fall asleep. The real thaw began 3 days later. Water started seeping down the inside of the vent. Not enough to rot the hay yet, but enough to threaten it. Martha had to act. She called a meeting. Not loudly, just rose from her bedding and stood near the pit in the center where the floor was packed hard with weeks of foot traffic. "Time to choose," she said. Everyone listened. "We stay and rot, or we walk and risk." Knox stood up slowly. "You think the land can carry us?" "No," she said, "but I think it has to." They weighed it all that morning. The baby, now strong enough to sit without coughing. Ruth, quiet but eating again. Jeffers, too weak to carry anything but still able to walk. Roy, now showing pink in his cheeks again. They weren't healed, but they weren't dying. It was time. Leaving the hay shelter was harder than building it. They stripped it in pieces, not for pride, but because it had become something more than structure. It was safety, memory, a tomb they hadn't died in. To dismantle it felt like betrayal, but they couldn't carry it with them, and to leave it whole meant it could invite others who might not understand what it had taken to survive there. So they took what they could: cord, cloth, twine, the driest layers of hay. They packed it tight into sacks, slung over shoulders, and makeshift sleds made from barn doors and window shutters. Roy tied a string of bent spoons into a noise line, dragging it behind them to scare off animals. Knox carried the baby. Martha led. As they walked, none of them looked back at the hay mound they left behind. Not once. The journey south was worse than the shelter. Snowbanks still towered over the broken roads, and frozen bodies lay half-buried in the ditches, horses and men alike. They saw a wagon turned over and cracked open, its contents long stripped, a cabin burned to the frame, its smoke long gone, but its black ribs still standing against the sky. On the second night, they slept under a rock overhang. Bodies curled in a semicircle. They ate bark again, drank water from melted snow filtered through linen, passed around a tin of lard like it was gold. Martha didn't sleep. She hadn't since they'd left. By the 4th day, they reached the railroad town. What they found was not salvation. Bitter Run, once a station stop with a general store, a cattle yard, and a wire telegraph, had been ravaged by the same freeze. Buildings shuttered, tracks half buried, survivors inside the depot station guarded by a gang of men with rifles and bad eyes. One of them stepped forward when Martha approached. "You come from the north?" She nodded. "You bring sickness?" She said nothing. He lifted his rifle, not quite aimed but close enough. Knox stepped beside her. "We bring nothing but cold and feet. We want no trouble." The man eyed their ragged train of walkers. 15 souls, no horses, no firewood. "You'll get a tent, no more," he said, "and no ration if you can't trade." Martha stared at him a long moment. "We didn't come for your charity, just your dirt." "What?" She pointed. "There, that edge of the fence. We'll dig there, build our own. Don't need your canvas, just water." The man laughed once. "Crazy woman. Ain't no hay left here to build another one of those rat huts." Martha didn't smile. "I won't need one," he shrugged. "Suit yourself." She built another shelter. Not hay, not this time. Earth and oilcloth and stone. It wasn't for survival anymore. It was for the children. A place to wait while the others went looking for supplies, for news, for someone to say the worst was truly over. Knox found a ledger in the depot office, scribbled with notes. 32 towns. Gone. Hundreds missing. Hundreds more dead. But the freeze had broken, and across the ridges, caravans were already starting to move again. Help was coming, eventually. They lived in Bitter Run for nearly 3 weeks. The depot let them stay after Ruth helped deliver a dying woman's baby, after Roy repaired a telegraph wire using nothing but a nail and twisted thread, after Knox fought off a drifter trying to raid the food cache and didn't ask for a bullet in return. By then, word had spread. People started whispering the name. "The Hay widow. She built it herself," someone said. "Kept 15 people alive. Laughed her out of town, I heard. She's the only reason half of them made it." Martha didn't listen to any of it. She was watching the baby. It had started crying again. Strong, loud, alive. One cold morning, she went walking through the edge of the settlement. Frost still lingered in the shadows. She paused near the gate and saw a rider coming up the trail. He wore an army coat, carried a dispatch bag. When he reached her, he asked, "You Martha Dillon?" She nodded. He handed her a letter. "From Springfield, aid office. Says you filed something last year." She opened it slowly. The words were stiff, bureaucratic, but near the bottom, one line stood out. "Relief package granted. Livestock and grain to be delivered when conditions permit. Shelter award approved." And beneath that, "Shelter approved for replication study." She didn't know what that meant, but it sounded important. She folded the letter, didn't smile, didn't cry. She just turned and walked back toward her makeshift camp, where the baby was wailing and the fire had gone out, and Roy was trying to boil bark again without burning the bottom of the pot. She stopped halfway and looked back, out past the hills, past the road that led north. There was still smoke in the sky, still ruins, still cold places with no laughter left. But not here. Here, in the ugliest little dugout anyone had ever mocked, was the warmest home in the freeze, and she hadn't needed a single log to build it. The spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in fits, stuttering through the valley like a child learning to walk. One day of warmth and trickling streams would be followed by 3 more of bitter wind and frostbite mornings. Bitter Run never smiled, never truly softened, but Martha knew it wasn't about waiting for the land to welcome them. It was about pressing onward anyway, and onward they did press. She and the others had come into the town as nothing more than a string of shivering figures, wrapped in patched blankets and dragging children who barely remembered the sun. But now they stood out for another reason. They were among the only group who had stayed intact through the worst of it. Families had fractured all around them, parents dead, children orphaned. Yet the 15 from the Hay-Bale shelter, those who had slept in breath-thick darkness and shared fox broth and frostbite dreams, had survived together. It gave them a weight, a strange authority. They didn't demand respect, but people gave it. That was the strangest part. They traveled west in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because words still felt too thin, too fragile for the things they had all carried through that endless freeze. It was spring by the calendar's reckoning, but the wind still tasted of pine frost and old regret, and the snowbanks along the tree lines hadn't given up entirely. The land thawed slow, as if it too were cautious now, unwilling to trust the sun again after the cruelty of that winter. They moved by foot, sometimes hitched to a wagon that Knox and a pair of young brothers had rebuilt from depot scrap. It wasn't meant for hauling people, but it gave the weakest, Ruth, the half-burned man whose name turned out to be Eli, the baby, some place to rest when their legs gave out. Martha walked at the front, always. No horse, no staff, just a thick cloak that had once been part of a church curtain, and eyes that didn't seem to blink much. People gave her space, not out of fear anymore, but reverence, the kind people used to give preachers or undertakers. She had kept them warm when no one else did. That didn't wash off easy. Somewhere beyond the third ridge, they found what looked like a homestead, barely standing, walls kicked in by wind and time. There were bones of cattle in the yard. A stove, rusted but whole, lay face down beneath a broken beam. A wellhead, half frozen, peeked up from a mound of moss-covered stone. Roy walked up beside her and pointed. "I could dig into that hill." "South side's dry," she nodded. "Good place for root stores. Clay's thick." Knox stood behind them. "You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking of sleeping under something that doesn't groan when it gets wet." Knox gave a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You want to settle here? For now. It wasn't about forever. Nothing on the frontier ever was, but this was high ground, sheltered. A creek ran close, and most important, no one else was here. They built again, not a hay-bale shelter this time. That chapter was closed. What they built now was different. Part sod, part earth, part the bones of the ruined homestead. They worked like ants, quietly, relentlessly. Martha taught them to dig narrow at first, widening as they went. The roof was packed with woven limbs and silt clay mixed with ash. Ventilation came from a chimney made of scavenged pipe. The door was a thick slab of ironwood, salvaged from a fence post, hung sideways and bolted with wire. Roy built a stove from rocks and brick shards. Fed by a sloped fire tunnel, Martha taught him to dig. Thin, long, efficient. Burn one log, and it held heat all day. The others laughed the first time they heard the plan. They weren't laughing when it worked. The stove burned, like a whisper, but kept the room warm enough that you could take off your boots inside. They called it the holler oven. Martha didn't name things, but the name stuck. By mid-April, they were drawing water from the well and had planted seeds in cleared soil, beans mostly, and wild potato if it would take. No one expected a real harvest yet. It was too soon, too dry, but it was a start. And then one day, as Martha was binding the edge of a quilt with thread stripped from an old saddlebag, she looked up to see a shadow on the ridge. A wagon, then two, then four. They came slow, cautious, like ghosts unsure if they were welcome. By dusk, there were 17 wagons outside the new settlement. Knox stepped out beside her, jaw tight. "You want to turn them back?" Martha shook her head. "This ain't Bitter Run. We got space, but we'll do it right this time." He nodded. "Your rules?" "No," she said. "Our rules, but I'll start them." That night, they lit a single fire in the center of the camp. Not a bonfire, not a signal, just warmth. A gathering place. And when the newcomers sat, Martha spoke for the first time in weeks. "This isn't a town," she said. "It's not a refuge. It's a shelter we're building, day by day. You don't come here to wait. You come here to work. You carry your part or you sleep outside." No one interrupted. "You follow the vent rules. You pack the floor tight. You don't waste heat. You don't hoard food unless you've grown it. And you don't get loud unless there's a reason." A man near the fire asked, "Who decides if there's a reason?" She looked at him. "We do, together. But I'll say the first few." A long silence followed. Then a woman stood. She was old, skin like bark, voice like a rusted gate. "You the one with the hay house?" "I am," the woman nodded. "Then I'll listen." So did everyone else. The days that followed were the beginning of something else. Not a town, not yet, but not just survival either. They called it Shelter Hill. The name stuck because people needed something to say when they wrote letters, when they carved into wood or scratched onto makeshift signs to point the way for others still wandering out from the freeze. And people did come, from the south, the west, even the rail lines where trains still hadn't run again. Some came hungry, some with hands too stiff to carry tools, some carrying children wrapped in blankets stitched from old church robes and horse feed sacks. Some brought nothing but themselves. Martha never turned them away, but she made them build first. She taught them in silence mostly. Her hands spoke, so did her back. Bent, straight, turned, always in motion. Her son Roy became the one who gave the actual instructions. He had a quiet voice, but it carried. Ruth took to watching the smallest children while others worked. Knox handled disputes. Eli, still healing, managed the food. Stock rationing better than anyone expected. Even Jeffers returned one day, skinny, quiet, with a wooden crutch and no apology. He helped reinforce the western wall and never once tried to lead again. By summer, Shelter Hill had 35 dugout homes, a shared root cellar, a long, narrow kitchen with a stone flue and twin holler ovens. The bureau sent a man to check in. He left with notes and a jar of pickled turnips, saying, "It's more organized than some real towns." Martha said nothing. She was watching the sky. One evening, a girl fell sick, fever, tight chest. They didn't panic. They sealed her room, boiled cloths. Ruth stayed with her day and night. When the fever broke, Martha told Roy, "Start building the second vent." But it's summer. She gave him a look. Build it anyway. He did. The next day, a small group tried to leave, said they didn't need rules anymore, said the worst had passed. Martha walked them to the ridge. You leave, she said. You leave clean. You don't take wood you didn't cut. You don't carry food you didn't cook. And if you come back, you build from scratch. They hesitated. She didn't. They left. They didn't return. By fall, Shelter Hill was a real place. It had no mayor, no jail, no church bell, but it had warm homes, shared walls, rules etched in sweat, and it had Martha Dillon. She never took a title, never sat at the center of things. But when storms threatened or people argued, they always found their way to her door. Once, Roy asked her, "Do you miss the old place?" She didn't have to ask which one. She looked past him, to the edge of the ridge, where the first Hay-Bale shelter had stood in that brutal winter, the one people mocked, then begged to enter. She thought about the oilcloth flap, the fox meat, the cracked hands, the silence of a girl named Ruth shivering in the corner and whispering spring when none of them believed it would come. She shook her head. "No, I don't miss it," Roy nodded. "But I remember," she said, then turned back to the stove and stirred the pot that would feed everyone by dusk. When the winter came again, it was gentler, but Shelter Hill was ready. The stoves burned slow and steady. The vents pulled out the damp. The dugouts held. No one froze. No one fled. And somewhere deep beneath the soil, in the hearts of those who had once lain packed together like firewood in a hay-bale shelter no one believed in, the warmth stayed. It never left again, because some homes are made of timber and stone, and some are made of belief.